You're still going, but something left before you did. Maybe you noticed it on a Sunday morning a few years back. Not a dramatic loss, no crisis of belief, no theological crisis you could point to. Just a slow draining. You sat down in the same pew, you heard the same scriptures, but the weight was gone. Something that used to press on you from the outside. Something that made demands, that confronted you with a standard you hadn't invented yourself, had been quietly replaced with something softer. Something that asked how you were feeling. Something that wanted to make sure you had support. You didn't leave, but you noticed. And then the question came, the one that's the hardest to say out loud, whether the problem was you. Whether you were too old, too rigid, too attached to a version of faith that was always more about control than grace. Whether what you were mourning was something real, or just the familiar. Here's what I want to give you today. A name for what was removed. Not a political argument. Not a denominational complaint. A clinical diagnosis. The kind that only becomes possible when someone who has no stake in the outcome looks at what faith actually does in the life of a society and asks what happens when that function disappears. The person who gave us that diagnosis is not who you'd expect. Theodore Dalrymple spent 20 years as a physician in a hospital and a prison on the outskirts of Birmingham, England. He treated the long-term poor, the chronically broken, the people for whom the promises of modern liberal society had produced nothing but wreckage. He watched, up close, what happened to human beings when the ideas governing their culture lost contact with the reality of their lives. He is also an atheist, a committed, unconcealed, lifelong unbeliever, which is why what he wrote in a 2007 essay for City Journal matters so much. The essay is called What the New Atheists Don't See, and in it, Dalrymple makes an argument that should have been inconvenient for everyone. He argues that the new secular critics of religion, the Dawkinses and Hitchenses of the moment, were winning a debate that had already been decided in practice, in a direction they hadn't noticed. The West had already been secularizing for decades, and what he saw from inside his hospital and his prison was not liberation. What he saw was a void, not a metaphysical void, a functional one. Religion, Dalrymple argues, performed specific civilizational work that nothing else had been built to replace. It transmitted the idea that the individual existed within a structure larger than himself, one that made real demands on him and held him to them. It gave people a vocabulary for guilt, for remorse, for the specific experience of having failed a standard you hadn't invented. And it offered a path through that guilt that ended somewhere. Confession, absolution, reorientation. A process with a conclusion. He is not arguing that the doctrines are true. He is arguing that the function was real, and that no secular institution had been designed to perform it. Replace Birmingham with Baltimore, and the year 2001 with right now, and the finding holds. What Dalrymple diagnosed in his patients, a sociologist named Philip Rieff, had already predicted 40 years earlier from the inside of the academy. Rieff's 1966 book, The Triumph of the Therapeutic, is one of the least read important books of the 20th century. His argument, stated plainly, is this: every culture is organized around a central human ideal, an image of what the fulfilled person looks like, what they pursue, what they owe others. For centuries in the West, that ideal was the religious man, someone whose life was oriented around obligations he hadn't chosen and couldn't renegotiate with himself. Rieff saw that ideal being replaced, not destroyed, replaced. The new ideal was what he called psychological man, someone whose primary obligation was to himself, whose highest goal was self-understanding, whose measure of a good life was whether it felt authentic. Not a sinful man seeking redemption, not a citizen seeking virtue, a patient, perpetually in the process of becoming more fully himself. Rieff wasn't hostile to this shift. He was just clear-eyed about what it meant. A culture organized around the therapeutic ideal, he wrote, would find it increasingly difficult to make binding demands on its members. Because binding demands, by definition, are things you don't get to renegotiate. What he didn't fully predict, what nobody predicted, was that the institution most threatened by this shift would eventually try to survive it by joining it. The movement has a name if you've been paying attention to what's been happening inside American Christianity over the last decade. It's called trauma-informed ministry. You can trace it through the pages of Christianity Today, through the Gospel Coalition, through the curricula being offered to small group leaders and youth pastors across denominational lines. The language is consistent: healing, processing, holding space, supporting your journey. The assumption underneath it is just as consistent, that what people bring through the church doors is primarily a wound that needs tending, and that the congregation's job is to provide a safe environment for that tending to happen. None of this is wrong in a narrow sense. People do bring wounds. Communities should have care. Compassion is not a concession, but something happened in the translation. The vocabulary of culpability, the words that had distinguished the religious tradition from every other institution, began to thin out. Guilt became trauma. Repentance became healing. Moral failure became a coping response to unmet needs. The question, "What does this ask of you?" was quietly replaced by, "How does this make you feel?" And the congregation that had once been a place of confrontation, a place where you were held to a standard exterior to your own preferences and told that meeting it mattered, began to feel like a support group, well-meaning, warm, fundamentally unable to do the specific thing that had made it irreplaceable. This is the moment to pause, because this is where the diagnosis gets precise and where the most important question gets asked. If you felt this shift, you know that it isn't subtle. The idiom changes. The music changes. The sermons start to sound less like they're addressing you as an accountable adult and more like they're managing you as someone who needs encouragement. The standard doesn't disappear exactly, but it softens into a preference, an aspiration, something you try to work toward, with support, at your own pace, in a space that honors where you are right now. And if you're honest, you've probably wondered, is the problem me? Am I the one who can't receive what's being offered? Did I confuse discomfort for substance? And is this actually a more mature, more loving version of faith? Here's what Dalrymple's 20 years in that hospital and that prison give you: the authority to say no, not because the old way was kinder or stricter or more beautiful, but because there is a specific function that the structure of religious obligation performed, and that function is not transferable to any softer frame. The reading companion in the link in the description is built around exactly this territory. 90 days, 30 of Dalrymple's most important City Journal essays, one a day, each with a reader's guide that gives you the key concept, the American application, and one question to sit with. If the diagnosis in this video pulled something into focus, the companion is where you develop the capacity to do that yourself, for any of the questions this channel keeps returning to. It's in the link in the description. Now, the part that took me the longest to understand, the part that I think explains not just why the church went therapeutic, but why going therapeutic made things worse rather than better. The therapeutic model, at its structural core, has a specific relationship with the problem it treats. Think about what Dalrymple observed in his patients. The ones who had been inside the mental health system, the social services system, the addiction counseling system for years or decades. There was something strange about their relationship with those systems. The systems were designed to help. And yet the help never quite resolved into independence. The patient returned. The appointment was rescheduled. The program continued. The crisis management became, slowly, a permanent state. Dalrymple is careful, and so will I be, not to attribute this to malice. The people working inside those systems were, in the vast majority, genuinely motivated by care. But the structure of the relationship had a logic of its own. The therapist is not paid for the cure. The therapist is paid for the process. A patient who achieves resolution no longer needs the therapist. There is, baked into the economics and the logic of the therapeutic relationship, an orientation toward the permanence of the problem. This is not a conspiracy. It doesn't require bad faith to operate. It only requires that the structure be absorbed without scrutiny. And what the church absorbed when it absorbed the therapeutic model was that structure. The congregation that once offered confession and absolution, a process with a beginning, a middle, and a definitive end, replaced it with a process that has no defined endpoint. You don't graduate from healing. You don't reach a state where the support is no longer needed. The horizon keeps moving. The work is always unfinished. The community is always there to hold you. This is the inversion that explains the emptiness you felt. Not that the church became less loving, not that the people in those pews became less sincere, but that the very mechanism the church imported in order to survive the therapeutic age, in order to remain relevant to a culture organized around psychological self-understanding, is a mechanism that cannot deliver what the church originally promised. The original promise was resolution. A reckoning with something exterior to yourself, a path through it, and an arrival on the other side. Not as a perfect person, but as a person who had been genuinely addressed, genuinely held to account, and genuinely released. The therapeutic model cannot make that promise. By its own internal logic, it is not designed to. And the church that decided to speak that language in order to keep its pews occupied found, over time, that it had hollowed out the one thing that made the pews worth occupying. What does this ask of you? Not a return. You can't unlearn what you've seen, and nostalgia is not a theology, not a fight. The argument about what the church should be is above your pay grade and mine. But Dalrymple gives you something specific, and I want to make sure you leave with it. What you felt was not rigidity. What you noticed was not the symptom of someone who had failed to grow. The thing that was removed from the church, the thing that made it distinct from every other community you could join, was the specific experience of being addressed from outside yourself, of being held to a standard you had not invented and could not renegotiate with your own preferences, of having your failures named as failures, and having a path through them that ended. That experience is not widely available anymore, which is exactly why you noticed its absence. C.S. Lewis, in The Abolition of Man, wrote about what happens when a culture systematically removes the idea that values exist outside the individual's own valuation of them. He wasn't talking about religion specifically. He was talking about a pedagogical project, the slow and systematic replacement of an objective moral order with the idea that values are expressions of feeling. His warning was simple. You cannot remove the standard and keep the obligation. Once you've told people that the demands made on them are only projections of someone else's preferences, you cannot later convince them to meet those demands. The church that decided to meet the therapeutic age on its own terms made exactly this trade. It removed the standard or softened it until it was indistinguishable from encouragement in order to seem less demanding to a culture that was increasingly suspicious of demands. And in doing so, it removed the one thing it could offer that the culture genuinely could not produce for itself. The question that stays after this video is smaller and harder than the diagnostic. If the function was real, if what Dalrymple observed, what Rieff predicted, what you yourself have felt in that silence, if all of that points towards something that was genuinely load-bearing in the architecture of a decent life, then the question is not how to restore it. It's whether you can still find it, and whether you can recognize it when it doesn't come in the form you expected. Your faith, the version of it that made demands on you, that confronted you with something real, that offered resolution and not just process, was not naivete. It was not rigidity. It was not the inability to evolve. It was the thing, the actual thing. And knowing that it was removed, knowing the mechanism, knowing the name, knowing that an atheist doctor on the outskirts of Birmingham spent 20 years documenting why it mattered, is not the same as getting it back. But it is the beginning of knowing what you're looking for. If you've sat in a service that felt more like a support group than a confrontation with something real, and you didn't know how to name what was missing, tell me what you were looking for. The specific thing, if you can. The Decent Mind Reading Companion, 90 Days Through Dalrymple's Essential Essays, is linked in the description.